For most of my parenting life, I held on to a story. It went something like this. Someday, when the kids were grown and gone, I would get something back. Time, myself, maybe even a version of the person I was before all of it started. The story had a name, and everyone used it. They called it freedom. They said it the way people say something they've decided to believe. Warmly, confidently, like a gift they were certain would arrive on time. I believed it too. I believed it for 20-some years, and then my last child left. And what arrived wasn't freedom. Here's what no one tells you about that moment. The story was wrong. Not wrong in a small way, wrong in the specific, disorienting way that a map is wrong when it shows you a road that doesn't exist. And you only find out when you're standing in a field, looking around, wondering where the road went. That's what I want to talk about today. Now, I want to be careful here, because I'm not saying the freedom story is a lie invented to hurt you. It isn't. Most of the people who said it to you meant it kindly. Some of them even lived it, or a version of it. There are parents who feel a genuine, uncomplicated relief when the nest empties. And those parents are not wrong for feeling that. And this video is not about them. This video is about the rest of us. The ones who expected freedom and found something else first. The ones who did everything right, raised good kids, loved them well, got them out the door, and then stood in a quiet house wondering why the gift hadn't arrived yet. Why the feeling underneath didn't match the word everyone kept using. What I'm not saying is that what's on the other side is bad. I'm not saying you won't find something real in this new chapter. I'm not saying the people who called it freedom were lying to your face. What I am saying is this. The freedom, if it comes, and I believe it does, doesn't come the way the story promised. It doesn't arrive when the last car pulls out of the driveway. It doesn't come from the absence of your children. It comes from something harder. Something that most of us spend the first months of an empty nest running away from as fast as we can. And I know that, because I ran from it too. Proof point 1. The plans were a costume. The week after my youngest left, I made lists. I'm not exaggerating. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook, and I wrote things down. A trip I'd been wanting to take. A class. A project I'd shelved for years because there was never time. I wrote and I planned and I filled pages. And there was a part of me that felt, while I was doing it, like I was finally living up to the freedom story. See? This is it. This is what they meant. And then the pen ran out of ink. I sat there with a dry pen and a notebook full of plans, and I waited for the feeling to follow the words. It didn't. What I felt instead was something I couldn't name. Not grief exactly, not emptiness exactly, something more like the specific hollowness of a performance that isn't landing. The plans weren't freedom. They were a costume I was wearing over the thing I wasn't ready to feel yet. Here's what I've come to understand about that first week. The busyness was not momentum, it was avoidance. And the thing I was avoiding wasn't the future, it was the present. The present was a quiet house. The present was the end of something enormous. The present required me to sit with a loss I hadn't been given permission to name. Because that's the thing about the freedom story. It doesn't leave room for loss. It skips right from the departure to the liberation, and it leaves out everything in between. If you filled that first week with plans, with projects, with calls, with movement, I want you to hear this without judgment. That was not you failing to grieve. That was you doing the only thing the story gave you permission to do. Move forward. Be free. Don't look back. You were doing what you were told. It just wasn't the whole truth. Proof point 2. What actually arrived was a mirror. A few months in, maybe 3, maybe 4, I was walking down the hallway on a Tuesday afternoon. No particular destination, no errand. The house was quiet in that way it had become, and I passed the bathroom mirror and I stopped. I don't know why I stopped, but I stood there and I looked at my own face for a long moment, And what I noticed wasn't sadness or relief or any of the emotions I'd been cataloguing and managing and performing for the people around me. What I noticed was that the face looked unscheduled. That's the only word I have for it. For 20 years my face had a job. It was the face that checked on people, that tracked what time it was and who needed what and whether everyone was okay. It was a face in motion, even when the body was still. And now it just wasn't. And I didn't know what it was for. That is not a comfortable thing to discover about yourself, but it is an honest one. And I think it's the thing the freedom story most completely glosses over. The empty nest doesn't just remove a responsibility, it removes an identity. And identities don't dissolve cleanly, they leave a residue, a shape, the outline of the person you were for 2 decades, still visible in the space where that person used to stand. You are not just a parent who no longer has children at home. You are someone who organized an entire self around a role that has now changed beyond recognition. Of course, you don't know what the face is for. You haven't had to ask that question in a very long time. The freedom story doesn't mention the mirror. It doesn't mention the moment you look at yourself and realize you've been so busy being a parent that you're not entirely sure who else you are. That moment is not failure. That moment is the beginning of something real. But it's only the beginning if you don't run from it. Proof point 3. The stillness is the thing, not the enemy. Here is what I eventually learned, and I won't pretend I learned it quickly or easily. The quiet I was afraid of was the only place the real thing was waiting. Not the plans, not the projects, not the trips booked on the credit card as evidence that I was thriving. The quiet. One evening, I don't remember which month it was, but it was getting toward the end of the first year. I sat on the back porch after dinner with a glass of water. No phone, no list, no reason to be there, except that I was tired of moving, and the evening was soft, and I just sat. And something arrived that I hadn't felt since before the lists, before the plans, before all of it. It wasn't joy. It wasn't the freedom story finally delivered. It was something quieter than that, something more like permission. Permission to exist without purpose, for just this moment. Permission to not know who I was becoming yet. Permission to be someone in the middle of something, rather than someone who had it figured out. That's not the freedom I was promised. The freedom I was promised had energy. It had plans and trips, and the image of someone blooming into a second act. This was different. This was the freedom underneath the freedom story, the one that doesn't photograph well, and doesn't make for a good response when someone asks how you're enjoying the empty nest. But it was real, and it was mine, and it only arrived when I stopped running from the quiet and let myself sit in it. Freedom was the story, silence was the truth. So why does this matter? Right now, today, if you're sitting in a house that used to be full. Because if you're performing the freedom story and it isn't landing, you're probably spending a lot of energy wondering what's wrong with you. Why don't you feel the way you were supposed to feel? Why don't the plans fill the space the way you expected them to? Why the quiet follows you from room to room like something you can't outpace? Nothing is wrong with you. What you're feeling is the weight of an identity that carried you for 20 years and is now asking to be renegotiated. That is not a malfunction. That is one of the most significant transitions a person can move through, and it has almost no cultural language for it. Just the freedom story, papering over the actual experience with a word that doesn't fit. You are not behind on your recovery. You are not failing at the empty nest. You are not ungrateful or weak or doing it wrong. You are someone who spent 20 years being needed every single day, and now you're not. And that specific grief, the grief of the useful, the grief of the person who was always the answer to someone's question, has almost no name, because everyone keeps calling it freedom. You don't have to call it freedom yet. You don't have to call it anything, but you do have to let yourself feel it, because the thing on the other side, the real thing, not the story, only comes after you stop skipping over this part. I said at the beginning that I was wrong. I was wrong about freedom. Not about whether it exists. I think it does. I think something real and yours waits on the other side of this. I was wrong about what it looks like, and when it arrives, and what it costs. The freedom I thought I'd feel when the kids left was supposed to be immediate, automatic. The return of something I'd lent out and was now getting back. That version of freedom never showed up. What showed up instead was slower and stranger and more honest. The gradual, quiet discovery that I was still someone, even without the role that had defined me. That there was a self underneath the scheduling and the carpools and the 20 years of being needed. That it was still there, a little dusty maybe, a little uncertain about what it was for, but there. That is not the freedom story, but it is freedom in the truest sense of the word I know. The kind that doesn't come from a departure, the kind that comes from staying in the quiet long enough for something real to surface, staying with yourself, which is something parenting can make it very easy to postpone for a very long time. You're not free yet. You might not be free for a while, but you're not stuck either. You're in the part the story skipped over, and that part has value. That part is doing something necessary, even when it doesn't feel like it, even when it just feels like a quiet house and a face in a mirror that looks a little unscheduled. Sit with it a little longer, not because the answer is in the silence, but because the silence is where you remember you have a self that is worth asking questions of. That's the freedom I found. It took longer, and it cost more, and it didn't look like anything I'd planned, but it was real, and it was mine, and I believe it's waiting for you too. If any of this felt familiar, if something in here named something you've been carrying without a word for it, I'm glad you were here. There's more where this came from whenever you're ready for it.